Hello, this is Dr. Gary Rose, and this is an introductory lecture on the science and treatment of substance use disorders circa 2020. In this lecture, I'll provide a general overview of our current knowledge regarding substance use and misuse. Before we begin, I must note that more than any other type of psychopathology, psychoactive substance use disorders have been forever intertwined with the extant sociocultural, economic, and political forces. Furthermore, there have been more misconceptions about the nature, course, and treatment of substance use disorders than about most other domains of psychopathology and human suffering. Consequently, I ask you to forget everything that you have heard about substance abuse and begin studying the field with an open mind. A very simple tool that we use when discussing the history of the field is the public health model of disease. This model simply asserts that in understanding a pathological entity, one must look at the role played by these three factors. One, what does the agent bring to the table? The agent is the pathogenic entity, a bacterium, toxin, or in the case of substance use disorders, a psychoactive substance. Thus, when one asserts that MDMA causes neuronal deterioration, one is attributing the disease process to the agent. That's an agent explanation. Two, host. How does the host contribute to the pathogenic process? If the host does not wash his or her hands, then the host is increasing the opportunity for the airborne virus to infect. For example, there is a long history of attributing the cause of substance abuse to the host. People who developed alcoholism, for example, were long considered to be morally bereft, infantile, lacking in impulse control, etc. These are all host attributions of causality. Three, the environment. How does the environment contribute to the pathological process? Legionnaire's disease in the 1970s, for example, was in great part caused by faulty HVAC systems in hospitals and resulted in scores of deaths. With regard to substance abuse, it has been long known that a very strong predictor of the rate of domestic violence is the number of liquor outlets in a neighborhood, for example. So as we discuss substance use disorders, we will refer to these three causal entities. Here's a brief history of alcohol-related problems going back to the 1600s. Back in the day, there was no such thing as alcoholism. First of all, beer, the principal alcoholic beverage, was healthier than water, so only an idiot would opt for water instead of beer. Secondly, low-level intoxication complemented farm work, which is generally boring and repetitive and did not require a high level of precision. Alcohol started to become a problem in the 1700s with the invention of distillation techniques. Distillation allowed for the production of high-potency alcohol beverages, such as gin and rum, and, as with other drugs of abuse, there is a significant difference between the effects of low-potency and high-potency variants of the same substance. In the late 1700s, per capita rates of alcohol use went through the roof, and one starts to read about alcohol-related diseases in this period of time. At this time, causality was almost exclusively attributed to the host in the form of the so-called moral model of addiction. Those who overdrank and suffered from alcohol-related problems were to be blamed for the problem as it was a function of their moral depravity, lack of character, and similar characterological deficiencies. Things started to change for excessive alcohol use with the onset of the industrial age. By the mid-1800s, more and more people of the Western world were living in urban areas and working in factories. Whereas a low-level buzz was compatible with agrarian work, it certainly didn't do anything for one's productivity or safety in the factory. There was a general movement at that time towards the promotion of the core values associated with self-control and precision. In the mid-1800s, people started to wear wristwatches, for example. A part of this new world order was the promotion of moderation in everything, including drinking. The early temperance movement promoted temperance in all areas of life and became a major social force in the second half of the 19th century. That movement, however, was co-opted by conservative social forces and morphed from the promotion of moderation to the promotion of absolute abstinence. The term teetotaler originated as a description of those who had signed the pledge of total abstinence. With this movement from moderation to abstinence came a change in focus away from the host and towards the agent. In the late 1800s, the cause of alcohol-related problems moved from the host, the moral model, to this agent. Alcohol was deemed to be such a potent toxin that its use needed to be prohibited. The demon was not the drunk, but rather the liquor industry. Alcohol came to have the same status then as do asbestos and lead paint now. The conservative attack against the liquor industry yielded prohibition, a really bad idea that was the law of the land for 13 years. We can thank prohibition for the promotion of organized crime. Without it, we never would have had movies like The Godfather, Casino, Goodfellas, or television shows like The Sopranos or Boardwalk Empire. Here is the 18th Amendment of the US Constitution. After 1 year from the ratification of this article, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within, the importation thereof into, or the exportation thereof from the United States and all territories subject to the jurisdiction thereof for beverage purposes is hereby prohibited. The Prohibition Amendment. And here is the 21st Amendment, which repealed the 18th Amendment of the US Constitution. Why was prohibition repealed? There were lots of reasons for repealing prohibition, including the social realities of the new freedoms associated with automobiles, safer sex, and the protracted adolescence of the middle class. A very immediate reason was that following the 1929 Wall Street crash, the federal government was broke and needed the tax revenues. This is not unlike the motivation of the governor of California to legalize marijuana 10 years ago. And we do have the prohibition to thank for NASCAR. Without prohibition, there would be no NASCAR. The men and women who became the first generation of NASCAR drivers were running rum from the revenuers during prohibition. After prohibition, they still had the taste for driving fast. And those who originated NASCAR had the wisdom to take the fast driving off the streets and put it on the tracks. Shortly after the repeal of prohibition, Alcoholics Anonymous was born when two compulsive drinkers sat down together and tried to help each other resist the impulse to drink. With the repeal of prohibition, the US was left without a coherent social policy regarding alcohol-related problems. The old model that had deemed the agent alcohol and its purveyors as the root causes of the problem no longer had credibility. Also, the anti-liquor industry bent of this model went counter to the political realities of the time. Purveyors of legal taxable liquor were now our friends. The American dispositional disease model developed to fill up this gap and endured as the belief system of the land until the end of the 20th century and in some places beyond. This model, by the way, never gained any traction outside of the US, the dispositional disease model. What are the principles of the dispositional disease model? First of all, we start with the assertion that there are people who are at risk for developing alcoholism and those who are not at risk. Those at risk are so because they have a genetically transmitted biological condition, an allergy to alcohol. By the way, US medicine was learning a tremendous amount about allergies in the 1930s. According to the dispositional disease model, if you have inherited this so-called allergy, you cannot drink alcohol in safety, for you will experience a loss of control and the initiation of a progressive and eventually fatal illness. If you do not have this allergy gene, then you can likely drink in safety and only risk developing an alcohol problem if your character defects leave you prey to the difficulties of gluttony. In this way, with the dispositional disease model, we find partial validation for the old beliefs that supported prohibition. The belief that alcohol per se was a serious toxic substance was true, but only for a portion of the human population, those with the inherited allergy. For others, the large majority of Americans, liquor was safe within moderation, similar to butter, ice cream, or a good Cuban cigar. As with other allergies, the treatment of choice for alcoholism, according to this model, was medical treatment with early diagnosis and intervention. Abstinence was the one and only treatment. The problem could not be cured, but only arrested. When one is allergic, say, to peanuts, one abstains from peanuts. If after 20 years of peanut abstinence, you eat a bag full, then you suffer from an allergic reaction. One can see how the allergy metaphor fashioned our 20th century ideas about the nature of alcohol and other substance use disorders. The dispositional disease model yielded the confrontation of denial treatment model. As opposed to other illnesses, alcohol was an illness of denial. The medical approach therefore deviated from standard medicine in that the substance use clinician often, or usually, needed to adopt a much harsher, very directive confrontational approach to the alcoholic, to break through the denial and to help arrest the disorder before it got worse, which presumptively it always would. Things started to change for the American addictions profession in the 1980s. Cocaine and crack cocaine use became a public health nightmare, and the AIDS epidemic demanded more grassroots approaches to these public health menaces. The dispositional disease model no longer appeared to be the answer to all of the challenges regarding substance abuse and addiction. There were many other new things happening in the 1980s. Under the Carter administration, federally sponsored household epidemiological surveys were initiated, giving us for the first time access to information about the problems of individuals who have never sought treatment. Linda and Mark Sobell demonstrated that chronic alcoholics within the VA system could learn to moderate their drinking, bringing into question the holy grail of abstinence as the only one treatment option for alcoholism. William R. Miller studied the abysmal success rates of intensive alcohol treatment and learned that the clinician's interview style was the best predictor of client success or failure. Finally, James Prochaska and Carlo DiClemente studied the self-change process in tobacco users and developed the now famous stages of change model of health behavior change. If you were an unemployed college student in the late 1970s, you often spent the summer going door to door, inquiring about current and past health conditions of the residents. Among the questions you asked were, does anybody in your household have an alcohol or illicit drug problem? Has anybody had such a problem in the past? If so, what is the status of the problem now? What did they do to resolve the problem? These questions and answers yielded the discovery that the typical alcoholic was not in any way similar to the patients in our treatment centers. They were problem drinkers with different kinds of alcohol problems, different patterns of drinking, and different treatment needs. In fact, most of them resolved their problems without treatment. We learned that chronic alcoholism represented no more than 10% of the population of people with drinking problems in the US. Linda and Mark Sobell used standard behavioral self-control techniques to train chronic VA alcohol-dependent men to drink with moderation. These results were so controversial in the late 1970s that they were forced to leave the US and pursue academic careers in Toronto for the next 20 years until returning to the United States early in the current century. William R. Miller started looking under the hood of addictions treatment processes and learned that very few client characteristics predicted success or failure of treatment. However, the practitioner variable of in-session interview style was so robust a predictor of success and failure that it overwhelmed any other predictive variables in terms of client characteristics, dual diagnosis, treatment characteristics other than in-session behavior, etc. Practitioners who utilized the classic confrontation of denial approach had poor outcomes across the board. Practitioners who adopted a more collaborative, shared decision-making approach invariably had better outcomes, independent of the characteristics of their clients. From these observations, motivational interviewing grew as an alternative to the then standard of care in the field of alcoholism and drug addiction treatment. Finally, Prochaska and DiClemente learned a number of things from tobacco users during the same decade. They learned that change takes time, that people go through a series of predictable stages, quote unquote, in the process of change, that most change occurs naturally via self-change rather than through treatment, and that the management of client ambivalence is key to the facilitation of these natural change processes. These observations, culminating in the development of the stages of change model, revolutionized our thinking about addictions treatment. Let's review the basic assumptions of the American dispositional disease model and discuss their evidence. Progressive and irreversible personality characteristics, treatment is necessary, leading to abstinence. Progressive and irreversible. The dispositional disease model asserts that alcoholism and all drug addiction is a progressive, irreversible disorder that, if left unchecked, will inevitably result in premature death. This assertion was the premise behind the development in the 1960s of corporate alcoholism treatment programs, now called employee assistance programs, wherein companies hired alcoholism counselors to help identify workers who were likely to be evidencing an alcohol-related disorder. The belief was that these problems could be identified earlier in the workplace than in other settings, and that early identification would lead to the arresting of the problem before the damage was more extensive. Are alcohol and drug problems irreversible and progressive? The answer is sometimes yes, but not usually. There are as many trajectories for alcohol and drug use over time as there are problem drinkers and drug users. The norm is definitely one of change, with ups and downs being more typical than the putative downward spiral of the dispositional disease model. There is also incontrovertible evidence that often alcohol and drug problems get better or disappear altogether. Denial. Is there an alcoholic personality? Significant for the use of denial, minimization, and other relatively immature psychological defenses. Is the individual at risk for alcohol and drug problems psychologically immature and suffering from a poorly developed character? Although the American disease model asserts such beliefs, 60 years of research has failed to identify any personality dimensions along which alcoholics differ from non-alcohol abusing individuals. Problem drinkers, 80% of people with alcohol problems, are no different than anybody else with regard to their character development, personality, style, insightfulness, or depth of self-exploration. The alcoholic personality is simply a myth. We still believe this because we tend to equate quote-unquote alcohol problem with quote-unquote chronic complicated alcoholism. And these latter individuals often do present with comorbid personality-related disorders, often secondary to the vicissitudes of homelessness, trauma, and cognitive impairment. Is abstinence the only pathway out of alcohol or drug problems? The classic disease model asserts this, in great part due to the belief that alcoholism cannot be cured, but can only be arrested. Remember the alcohol allergy metaphor at this point. However, scientific data have indicated that there are actually 3 pathways out of substance use problems: abstinence, non-problematic use, and something called the reverse gateway, swapping a less risky substance for a more risky one. Importantly, non-problematic use is a well-established outcome. How do people decide on an outcome? They decide on an outcome based on what outcome fits best with their lifestyle. Is treatment required? Another assertion of the dispositional disease model. Are there non-treatment pathways out of substance abuse? Roads to recovery. Again, data indicate a yes answer. In fact, the norm for successful change is natural change. Only 10% of the successful changers utilize treatment, and another 10% self-help, such as AA. Most individuals who successfully resolve alcohol and drug problems do so on their own, employing the same natural change processes that one uses to address other social and health problems. Natural change entails decision-making, planning, and the execution of an action plan consistent with personal values and goals. This is the strategy whereby we make most big changes in our lives, including the resolution of alcohol and drug problems. In this portion of this lecture, we will discuss the salient attributes of various drugs of abuse. We start with alcohol, the most popular psychoactive substance, both historically and at present. We need to start our discussion by defining a standard drink of alcohol. One standard drink contains approximately 1/2 ounce of pure ethanol, or 20 mg% blood alcohol equivalent. Therefore, there's a similar amount of ethanol in each of the standard drinks listed in this slide. Although there are some subtle differences in the rate of absorption of high-proof versus low-proof beverages, whiskey versus beer, for example, once in your bloodstream, ethanol is ethanol. Alcohol has an interesting way of leaving your body. Principally metabolized in the liver, alcohol is metabolized before it heads to your brain. This is called first-pass metabolism. The rate at which alcoholism is metabolized is constant. This is called steady-state metabolism, and is different than the way all other drugs of abuse are metabolized. All other drugs of abuse metabolize at a rate determined by the half-life of the drug. In other words, if a drug has a half-life of 4 hours, 2 hours after ingestion, half of the drug has left your body. If you ingest 4 grams of cocaine and the cocaine has a 2-hour half-life, 2 hours later, 2 grams have been metabolized. If you ingest 8 grams of cocaine, 2 hours later, 4 grams have been metabolized, and so on. In steady state metabolism, the rate of removal of the drug from your body is constant, no matter how much you've ingested. With alcohol, this constant rate is approximately 1 standard unit per hour. If you drink 6 drinks, 1 hour later, there will be 5 drinks in your system. If you drink 12 drinks, 1 hour later, there will be 11 drinks in your system, and so on. Because of this steady state metabolism, one's blood alcohol level can continue to rise even if one's drinking rate decreases. The only way to maintain a steady blood alcohol level is to drink 1 standard drink per hour. 1 drink in, 1 drink out per hour. Because of steady state metabolism, it is generally very easy to calculate approximate blood alcohol levels if you know how much somebody has been drinking and for how long. Conversely, if you have a blood or breath alcohol reading and know when and for how long the individual was drinking, you can also easily estimate the total amount of alcohol they have ingested during that period of time. Here are some typical blood alcohol level correlates for naive to moderate drinkers. More practiced drinkers develop tolerance to some of the effects of alcohol, and the effects chart would be adjusted upward a bit for them. However, nobody ever develops tolerance to the cognitive impairment associated with the various blood alcohol levels. One may appear not to be intoxicated, however, judgment, memory, and most executive cognitive functions remain impaired. In the absence of a history of alcohol problems, moderate drinking is actually healthier than our abstinence or excessive drinking with respect to cardiac health and protection from various cancers. These are a representative list of healthy drinking guidelines. For folks who are choosing a moderation route out of an alcohol problem, daily drinking is discouraged because it is associated with a more rapid development of tolerance and an increased possibility of health problems. Note that daily drinking is the preferred drinking plan for those who have no incidence, lifetime incidence of alcohol problems, but not for people who've had an alcohol problem of any degree whatsoever. Here's a short list of contraindications for a moderation goal of alcohol problem resolution. Signs of alcohol dependence, evidenced by signs and symptoms of physical tolerance and withdrawal, contraindicate a moderation goal, as does a history of failed moderation attempts, cardiac, GI, liver, and other health problems, or a context wherein social supports do not approve of or support a moderation goal. If somebody has achieved stable abstinence from alcohol, a conversation about the reasons for making a switch is indicated. There certainly are good reasons to migrate from complete abstinence to moderation. However, motivations and risk factors need to be discussed prior to initiation of a moderation trial. Learning to moderate alcohol use follows a similar process as does learning to moderate any other high-risk health behavior. The same behavioral self-control procedures that one uses to manage food intake, exercise, and blood sugar control work for alcohol moderation. This is why we now consider alcohol and drug use problems simply as a subset of high-risk health behaviors managed or maintained by one's lifestyle. As with all forms of behavioral self-control, moderation training begins with self-monitoring. Clients need to be taught how to calculate standard drink units and sometimes need help in addressing questions about self-monitoring, although this is less of an issue now that people rudely access their smartphones in the middle of conversations around dinner and drinks. Self-monitoring helps determine baseline drinking behavior, high-risk situations, and target goals. Also, as we all know, self-monitoring in itself often triggers positive change. Once targets are set for daily and weekly drinking, the client is taught to modify drinking behavior. There are many ways that this is achieved, including switching to a less preferred type of alcohol, avoiding sweetened drinks, lowering the proof level of the alcohol one drinks, corking the bottle and returning it to the shelf in between pours, etc. Modifying drinking behavior itself is also important. Here we focus on timing drinks, alternating alcoholic with non-alcoholic beverages, and modifying sipping pace. Again, these tactics are consistent with those one would use if engaging in behavioral self-control training for dietary modification. Drink refusal. If one often drinks with peers, drink refusal skills training may be indicated. This entails practicing assertive communication, defining acceptable excuses that may be offered for not wanting to drink to excess, and also avoiding high-risk situations where over-drinking is likely. The identification of high-risk drinking situations is an important component of moderation training. Individuals are advised to abstain from alcohol use in situations that have been previously associated with overdrinking. For example, if one tended to overdrink when anxious, anxiety is a trigger for not drinking. If one tended to overdrink when happy, celebratory drinking is to be avoided, and so on. The inventory of drinking situations is an excellent self-report instrument to be used to obtain an understanding of the individual's drinking patterns. This profile is associated with, quote, good times drinker, somebody likely to overdrink when feeling happy and when in the company of friends. Here is the profile of the negative affect drinker, somebody likely to overdrink when in conflict with others or when feeling angry, blue, or otherwise dysthymic. One would collaborate with the good times drinker regarding strategies for avoiding overdrinking when happy, and with the negative affect drinker regarding avoiding using alcohol to manage negative moods. Clearly, there is no one-size-fits-all equation for successful moderate drinking. One simple technique for managing high-risk drinking situations is the New Roads exercise, wherein one elicits from the client typical triggers for overdrinking, the goals of such drinking, and new non-drug use ways to address these triggers. This slide demonstrates the application of this strategy. Let's now briefly discuss opiates, another class of central nervous system depressants. Here's a brief history of opioid use in the United States. Opium was introduced to China by the British as they were growing massive crops of opium in India and needed new markets for their opium. Opium was introduced to the US in the early 19th century by Chinese immigrants. Its early use was almost exclusive to the West Coast. Morphine was used in great quantities to treat battlefield wounds during the Civil War, and Civil War veterans became the modal opiate addicts of the mid-19th century. By the last quarter of the 19th century, the quote-unquote typical opiate addict was your great or great-great-grandmother, as opiates were available in all sorts of patent medicines to address health problems such as cramps and general malaise. Great-grandma would typically ingest a potion made up of laudanum, a mixture of opium and alcohol. In 1898, heroin was synthesized from morphine, providing a higher potency form of medicinal and recreational opiate. The invention of the hypodermic needle in 1910 opened up the intravenous route of heroin and morphine administration. There was so much opiate use around the beginning of the 20th century, the federal government sought to control availability, which it did in 1914 via the Harrison Narcotics Act. Note that cocaine was also controlled under this act, and with this we see the beginnings of the mislabeling of cocaine as a narcotic, which it is not. Narcotics are natural or synthetic opioids. As mentioned earlier, sociopolitics always has a place in the world of psychoactive substance abuse policy, as demonstrated by this 1910 summary of the federal report that precursed the Harrison Act. Of course, the motives of the all-male, all-white US Congress are always and have always been completely noble. Sarcasm intended. Although controlled by prescription, narcotics abuse continued in the 20th century. Between 1900 and the onset of World War II, the typical urban heroin user was a recent European immigrant living in a major US city. Post-World War II, the European immigrants had left the inner city neighborhoods for the suburbs, and the new inner city inhabitants, the Black and Hispanic Americans, became the modal users of street heroin. Note how relatively recent a phenomenon is minority heroin abuse. In the 21st century, here are your so-called typical heroin users. As we know, heroin abuse has become a major public health concern for urban and non-urban adolescents and young adults. This, by the way, has less to do with the pharmacology and much more to do with the behavioral economics of heroin. Heroin is relatively inexpensive, easily available, and comes with little short-term opportunity cost. It serves as a potent positive reinforcer for those whose lives are otherwise bleak. Natural opiates. 3 classes of opiates are derived directly from the opium poppy: opium, morphine, and codeine. Heroin is a semi-synthetic opiate, sometimes called an opioid, which is derived from morphine. The only difference between heroin and morphine is the former much more readily passes through the blood-brain barrier. Once in the brain, heroin reconverts to morphine. With heroin, one obtains a more rapid and higher dose of morphine in the brain and a greater potential for rapid development of addictive behavior. Heroin is snorted, injected into the veins, or distributed subcutaneously via, quote, popping. Heroin is also smoked, by the way. The IV route is generally preferred unless one has access to very strong, pure heroin, in which case snorting or smoking yields the same high as would injecting weaker preparations. This was the case in Vietnam, where the availability of high purity heroin resulted in high rates of smoking and snorting, but low rates of injection of heroin. Heroin, by the way, is a potent antipsychotic. It is often used by trauma sufferers. If there is a history of trauma or psychosis in the individual you're working with, be very careful if you are detoxing this client from heroin, as they are very likely to experience a psychotic episode or a reoccurrence of PTSD terror upon successful detoxification. These are the classic effects of heroin and other opioids. By the way, the term opiates refers to natural opioids, and opioids refers to both natural and synthetic components, the latter including Vicodin, oxycodone, etc. Here are the typical symptoms of opioid withdrawal. Just about everybody who uses opioids for a period of time develops physical dependence. However, most who develop physical dependence do not also develop addictive behavior. For example, most pain patients, when successfully detoxed from opioids, do not consequently show any form of drug-seeking behavior. Detox from opioids is uncomfortable but rarely life-threatening. This, by the way, is not the case for alcohol withdrawal, where there often is a significant risk of seizure, stroke, and cardiac-related disease. Let's move on to cocaine. Cocaine is derived from the coca plant. It is not a narcotic and has very few of the same addictive properties as do the opioids, alcohol, and barbiturates. Cocaine was also not a problem when it was only available as a low-potency drug, as in Coca-Cola prior to the 1914 Harrison Narcotics Act. As is often the case, there is a major difference in the health and addictive effects of low-potency versus high-potency cocaine. Cocaine is snorted as a powder, injected as a soluble salt, and smoked as crack. It is very effective at elevating the neurotransmitter dopamine, which accounts for its extremely high addictive potential, and also metabolizes in the body into endogenous opioids, which account for much of the pleasure effect of the drug. Cocaine impacts the dopamine system and the opioid systems within the neurological substrate of the human mind. Tolerance develops rapidly to cocaine as a function of changes in the half-life of the drug. People who develop cocaine tolerance metabolize the drug much faster than do naive users. This means that the duration, but not the intensity of the high, decreases. This is very different than the tolerance effect associated with opioids and alcohol, where the intensity of the high decreases and the duration remains relatively fixed. There is a neurotransmitter-associated withdrawal syndrome associated with cocaine use, noteworthy for dysphoria and an elevated brain reward threshold. The brain reward threshold refers to how stimulating a reinforcer is needed to register neurophysiologically as a reward. The biggest acute health risk associated with cocaine is death from heart attack and stroke. Crack is the big daddy of all coca plant preparations. It is marketed in small, inexpensive units, enters the bloodstream and brain extremely rapidly through the lungs, quickly delivering a very high dose to the brain. The high is intense but very short-lived. If one wanted to write a prescription for rapid addiction, it would specify rapid entry into the bloodstream, intense high, rapid blood level drop. In other words, one would prescribe crack. Cocaine and alcohol are frequently used together. Cocaine enhances the bioavailability, rather alcohol enhances the bioavailability of cocaine, increasing the intensity and duration of the high. Cocaine enhances binge alcohol use, as it allows one to tolerate higher blood alcohol levels without passing out. The problem with this is that cocaine metabolizes faster than the alcohol. When the cocaine blood level decreases below threshold, the full force of the blood alcohol level is experienced, often resulting in passing out. If one is driving when this occurs, the outcome can be fatal. There is yet another reason that people are attracted to the co-ingestion of alcohol and cocaine. Once in the bloodstream, cocaine and alcohol co-metabolize into a third psychoactive substance, cocaethylene. Cocaethylene is essentially cocaine on steroids. Cocaethylene creates an exceptionally intense and long-acting high, which is exceptionally reinforcing at the level of blood-brain neurochemistry. The downside of cocaethylene is the marked increase in cardiac risk. Many so-called cocaine-related deaths are better understood as cocaethylene-related deaths, as the deceased individual was co-ingesting alcohol and cocaine when the reaper came a-calling. There's a good reason to keep cocaine and crack use illegal. Watch any 1990s Steven Seagal movie to find out why. Cocaine use triggers violence. This is a pharmacologically related phenomenon that would not go away if the drug were legalized and its distribution controlled. A brief discussion of benzodiazepines, the major class of anxiolytics, is in order. There is currently a marked reluctance among physicians to prescribe benzodiazepines because of the presumptive addictive potential. Although benzo use does indeed trigger physical dependence, they are rarely used as drugs of abuse. In fact, the only people at risk of benzodiazepine abuse are individuals with a current or lifetime incidence of another psychoactive substance use disorder. This is further evidence of the need to separate out the phenomenon of physical dependence, which is a health consequence of drug use, from addictions. Benzodiazepines have a relatively low addictive potential because they do not impact the dopamine system of the brain. The fact that benzos do not have high addictive liability does not mean that they are a particularly good treatment for anxiety or sleeplessness. Indeed, because of the development of tolerance, excuse me, they are relatively ineffective as a long-term anxiolytic or soporific. Used periodically, however, they can be like the cat's pajamas. Now let's discuss cannabis. Cannabis is a mixed sedative stimulant drug, and in its most potent formulations has hallucinatory properties. THC, the psychoactive ingredient in cannabis, binds to cannabinoid receptors in the brain. Naturally occurring endogenous cannabinoids serve analgesic and gross motor control functions, and THC also subserves these systems. THC has very little addictive liability, as it does not significantly impact the dopamine neurotransmitter systems of the brain. This does not mean that there is no such thing as severe cannabis-related problems. It simply means that one does not observe the kind of automatic craving level addiction with cannabis that one observes with heroin, cocaine, alcohol, nicotine, or amphetamines. Cannabis-related problems may be severe, but they are fundamentally different from these quote-unquote true drug addictions. In the short term, cannabis is associated with appetite stimulation, antiemesis, and the resolution of glaucoma. In the long run, its legalization helps balance the budgets of California, Oregon, Colorado, and Massachusetts. Negative effects include memory deficits and driving impairments while under the influence. There is also an increased risk of respiratory and testicular cancer. However, there is also evidence that THC decreases tumor size for a variety of cancers. Does chronic cannabis use cause irreversible cognitive impairment? This recent meta-analytic study suggests not. 3 meta-analyses indicate that cannabis-related cognitive impairments resolve after 25 days of abstinence. Once the THC residuals have left your body and cannabis withdrawal has resolved, one returns to the baseline level of cognitive functioning. The so-called cannabis-related amotivational syndrome and related executive cognitive function deficits likely either predated the cannabis use or are signs of another cognitive or psychological disorder. In other words, put down the doobie and earn a Nobel Prize. So what causes addiction anyway? The classic model of addiction is the opponent process model. Often called the opiate model, the opponent process model of addiction relies on the phenomenon of pharmacodynamic tolerance and withdrawal to explain addictive behavior. After a number of times using opiates, alcohol, or barbiturates, one's body systems come to accommodate to the presence of the drug. For example, since these three classes of drugs all decrease heart rate and blood pressure, the cardiac system of the individual with pharmacodynamic tolerance increases to maintain a steady state, i.e. homeostasis. When the drug metabolizes out of the system, the body is slow to respond, resulting in a state of withdrawal, wherein the accommodating systems now yield a non-normal state. Blood pressure is non-normally high, as is cardiac rate, etc. This is uncomfortable, and according to the opponent process model, creates a drive to return to a homeostatic state, which for the addict means another dose of drugs. The plot thickens a bit because stimuli associated with drug use, for example, Jimi Hendrix riffs, also come to trigger this psychodynamic accommodative process, such that those physically dependent on opioids can experience withdrawal effects even in the absence of drug use, triggering urges to use that are not associated with, quote, true withdrawal. This is a classic negative reinforcement paradigm and yields the assertion that addicts do not use to get high, they use to get normal. As catchy as this aphorism is, it simply does not correspond well to the realities of cocaine, the realities of use and relapse patterns among addicts, and it fails completely to explain cocaine addiction. Cocaine use is not associated with classic pharmacodynamic tolerance, withdrawal, and conditioned withdrawal, and yet cocaine is a highly addicting substance. As compelling as was the opponent process model's assertion that physical dependence explained addiction, the cocaine epidemic of the 1980s and the 1990s served as the death knell for this classic explanation of drug addiction and relapse. Enter stage right. The proponent model of addiction, otherwise known as insensitive sensitization theory. This model, sometimes called the cocaine model of addiction, explains drug addiction and relapse with reference to the neurophysiological actions of drugs of abuse. From the proponent perspective, try saying that 10 times fast, physical dependence is not a cause of addiction, but merely a health consequence of chronic drug use. The cause of addiction is found in the prefrontal cortex and midbrain pathways of dopamine. Drugs with addictive liability have in common with each other the fact that they all elevate the level of available dopamine at the neural synapses in the ventral tegmental region of the midbrain and in the prefrontal cortex. Most of this dopamine action occurs in the midbrain, not in the cerebral cortex. Because of this, most addictive behavior is not cognitively mediated. There are no language-based representations for the urges, motivations, and other addictive behaviors of the, quote, true craving level addict. Just as one usually does not think about breathing, once addicted, one does not think about the urges to use drugs. This is not denial, it is basic neurobiology. So what is the function of dopamine, especially in the midbrain? There are many functions of dopamine and at least 3 dopamine systems in the brain. Dopamine has also been implicated in many forms of psychopathology in addition to drug addiction, including schizophrenia and major depression. Dopamine is fundamentally about motivation. It marks an event or behavior as having survival status, as worthy of being done again and again. Thus, dopamine mediates drives for satiation of thirst and hunger, the drive to procreate, and the fight or flight response. Drugs of abuse mimic the neurobiological status of these survival drives and, quote, fool the brain into thinking that cocaine ingestion, for example, is necessary for survival. Activities, substances, and biological states that elevate dopamine at the neural synapses develop motivational salience, develop the non-cognitive mediated urge to do it again and again. Unfortunately, much of the professional literature on dopamine mistakenly has described dopamine as marking pleasure or quote-unquote liking. In fact, dopamine has often been described as the pleasure transmitter. This is not true. The sense of euphoria or pleasure associated with drug abuse comes from activation of the opioid, nicotinic, or cannabinoid, among other receptors. Dopamine is involved with motivation, not pleasure. The dopamine-mediated motivational process is said to be implicit because it must be inferred by an observer. It is not explicit or reportable by the drug user. As one uses and reuses drugs with addictive liability, the brain becomes more and more sensitive to the dopamine elevation effect. Wanting of the drug, therefore, increases. Importantly, this quality of wanting is non-cognitively mediated. It's implicit. This state of increased implicit wanting is called incentive sensitization. Once sensitized, one's brain remains in this state chronically, which explains the higher rate of relapse, especially for cocaine use. Cocaine addicts can be abstinent for years and then relapse out of the blue. Incentive sensitization also explains a phenomenon of cross-addiction, wherein abstinent drug addicts begin to demonstrate behavioral addictions such as gambling, sexual promiscuity, addictive spending, etc. As we know from discussions of tolerance, the pleasurable effect of most drugs decreases over time, and one must increase the dose to get the same pleasurable effect. Liking decreases at the same time that wanting increases. This explains a seemingly odd phenomenon of compulsive drug use in the absence of pleasure. Drug addiction is driven by the action of the quote-unquote wanting system of the brain, not the hedonic liking system of the brain. Drug reuse has much less to do with the remediation of a state of hedonic displeasure, i.e. withdrawal, and much more to do with the pursuit of activities that the brain has deemed necessary for survival. This is a profoundly different way to think about addiction that completely supplants the classic, quote, addiction as withdrawal medication, end quote, model. It has the added value, too, of helping us understand why drugs as pharmacologically different as heroin, cocaine, nicotine, alcohol, and caffeine can yield similar patterns of drug-seeking behavior. So if drug seeking is all about the universal brain neurochemical functions, why are there not more addicts? Because individual and contextual variables significantly impact the development and maintenance of addiction, even though craving level addiction is so intimately tied with brain neurophysiology. One of the attributes of the incentive sensitization model of addiction is that one can order the addictive liability of a drug based on how effectively it elevates dopamine levels in the midbrain. Cocaine is more effective at this than any other current drug of abuse, especially when smoked as crack, and has the highest addictive liability. A rat will continue to press a lever to get a dose of cocaine, even when experiencing heart attack and seizures. The only thing that stops the rat's self-ingestion is death. In contrast, drugs that do not demonstrate classic addictive pictures have in common the fact that they do not elevate dopamine, or in the case of LSD and cannabis, actually decrease dopamine levels. These drugs cause problems, but they don't cause the automatic craving level problems seen with cocaine, alcohol, and opioid addiction. The other noteworthy observation is that certain behaviors are associated with dopamine elevation. Recent data sets indicate that gambling and other so-called behavioral addictions also elevate dopamine, suggesting a non-psychological explanation for cross addictions, especially among those whose brains have first been altered by drug use. Finally, there is evidence that the experience of trauma elevates dopamine and results in a sensitized brain. Take a bunch of rats, traumatize them by piping techno rock into their cage, and then observe their drug-seeking behavior. The traumatized rats can't get enough cocaine. The rats, however, that listen to Barry Manilow still prefer water to Coke. Ask any rat, the stronger the dopamine effect, the stronger the drive to abuse. Add in a bit of premorbid traumatization or pre-existing behavioral addiction, and the process occurs even faster. This concludes his introductory lecture on substance use and abuse. If you have any further interest in this topic, please contact me, Dr. Gary Rose. I can best be reached at my website, GaryRoseTraining.com. Can also be reached via William James College in Boston, Massachusetts. I hope this has been helpful, and I thank you for your time.